great to speak with you, Jonathan. I'm very curious to hear your talk. So I'm at about 20, 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll keep it short. But the argument I'm going to make is very simple. Currently, there's about hundreds of urban villages in China that are being completely demolished, and I'm going to argue for alternatives to demolition. When we started doing this research, I was actually in Hong Kong about 5-6 years ago. I saw this happen all over China, all these villages that were being demolished, and at that time it was still somewhat controversial to say something about it. I think right now there's somewhat of a paradigm shift, and Tong Ming, who's from Tongji Urban Professor, he can probably speak about that. I think more and more cities are starting to realize that outright demolition is probably not the best idea. There might be better ways to integrate them into the city fabric. So maybe the argument I'm going to make is very basic and maybe not so radical as it used to be. So it's material from an edited book that I done with some colleagues when I was in Hong Kong, and I invited a lot of people who knew a lot more about this topic than I did to contribute. But I came to Hong Kong already with the interest in urban informality, having studied some other forms of this, and what strikes me as fascinating that urban informality takes a very different form in different contexts. So in Rio, it's hillsides. You have the favelas. If you go to the United States, hillsides very often places of luxury villas. It's so fascinating that these conditions really vary. You've probably also heard of urban informality occurring in so-called slum skyscrapers. If you watch the TV series Homeland, you've probably seen this shot of Liede, a victim of the global financial recession, later inhabited by squatters. Urban villages, or literally villages in the city in China, is also a form of urban informality, but as I will show, quite differently from other contexts. Currently, there's hundreds of them are being demolished, and there used to be this form of urban informality in Hong Kong, we call it walled city, and right before it was demolished, the conditions in these places were documented by a Japanese team of researchers from this book, which I don't know how to pronounce, but I encourage you to read it, because it's got these beautiful sections in which they very vividly portray the living conditions of these unique settlements. And it's gotten a lot of press lately. This was a settlement in Hong Kong that was under jurisdiction of the Chinese government when Hong Kong was ruled by the British, and as a result, it wasn't subject to the local planning and building regulations. So it was allowed to they were allowed to build as they pleased, and as a result, cost was also significantly lower. It was a lot cheaper to live there, so it became an entry point for Chinese migrants into the city of Hong Kong. And although it has a kind of a negative reputation as a hotbed for triads, at the same time, there were a lot of, it provided a very important function to a lot of a large migrant population. So there's some similarity with these Chinese urban villages. Well, first of all, is that they break local building regulations because they're not subject to these regulations as they're outside of the city limits. And what you get these very tall buildings with narrow alleys. And with buildings so close to each other that they call them kissing buildings, or also handshake houses. You can literally extend your hand and shake hands with your neighbor across the street. Sometimes the buildings are so close to another that the locals speak of a thin line sky or a one-line sky. But although it's easy to misperceive these developments as slums, a closer look shows that actually the residents of these villages are not the urban poor. In fact, they are productive citizens, many of them blue-collar workers, but also we found that there was a lot of students or even white-collar workers living in these settlements. So how did they come to be? In the early 1980s, at the cusp of economic reform, the Chinese government could only achieve a partial privatization of land in the countryside. It only had enough capital to buy up the farmland, but not the actual land on which the citizens, the villagers lived. The villagers, now landless, having sold their land to the city, they literally went from growing vegetables to renting out apartments to a large influx of migrant workers. So this process happens, continues to happen today. It's a result of three major issues. Well, the first is rapid urbanization. So in the Pearl River Delta, we probably witnessed the world's fastest and most and largest urban growth in history. And what used to be a collection of fishing villages and small towns has now become the world's largest megacity region. People estimate about 120 million people. That's the population of Germany and Spain combined. Shenzhen, we all know as an example, it's come from a collection of villages, about 1,000 villages, to a true megacity of what people estimate to be about 15 million. But what's interesting to note is that it's a very large portion of this population is a so-called floating population, because they do not have city rights, or to be more specific, they do not have an urban hukou, which is the household registration system that divides Chinese citizens in either urban or rural. So under a rural hukou, if you come from the countryside and you move to the city, you do not qualify for the same benefits as people under urban hukou. You do not have access to the same healthcare or education, including social housing. So because of their exclusion of these benefits, very often they went to the villages to find a cheaper place to live. So Shenzhen very often is called as a fishing village. Well, it used to be a collection of many villages. And here you can see in red the villages that still today, but now have become urbanized as a result of the growth in the city. So if you compare the rental costs of a unit in the urban village versus the formal market in the city, sometimes up to 10 times cheaper. You can see the difference of the formal versus the informal rental market in Beijing. So urban villages exist throughout China, but mainly in Beijing as well as the south of China. Here you see a map of Guangzhou, all the urban villages, and it's about 300 of them currently. So if you have a second, I recommend you to do that. Go into Google Earth and type in Shenzhen or Guangzhou and zoom in, and it's actually very easy to distinguish these urban villages, because they have a morphology that's fundamentally different of the dominant urban fabric of Chinese cities. This is kind of the Corbusian towers in the park, very large setbacks, very large structures in super blocks. And very large urban blocks are not really pedestrian friendly, but they're about 500 meters by 500 meters, so it's a long space to get to an intersection, versus this fine-grained urban fabric, this traditional urban fabric that urban designers fetishize, with the narrow streets, winding, organic patterns that we also see in European medieval cities. If you look closer, a lot of these villages, they're also mixed use. So they tend to have one high street with a lot of functions. And each village very often specializes in one type of industry. So sometimes it's a beauty industry, as in this case. And we translated all the shop names, including one that's very fitting. Beauty always benefits. And others, they specialize in, for instance, electronic components. Sometimes they're very successful. For instance, the village of Shibai in Guangzhou is up to date, sets the price for certain electronic components. So this whole village, which is about, I think, 80,000 people, they, as a whole, they participate in the production of certain components. If you look at the typical house, it's also mixed use. You have a ground floor that's very often commercial, and this is good for entrepreneurs who can live above the unit that they work in. And these are things that are actually not possible to do in the formal city because of the outdated zoning codes, which promoted mono-use, certain areas that are only residential versus certain areas that are only commercial. So ironically, these places were, from a urban design perspective, mixed use and pedestrian friendly, that were kind of very pleasant conditions that you cannot achieve in the formal city because of these building regulations. They're incredibly efficient, so up to 10 to 20 times more dense than the surrounding area. And they also have this long historic relevance. So this village, for instance, is about 800 years old, and it has these old canals, and it uses these canals for the staging of Chinese opera events. Unfortunately, it seems to be too late for a lot of these villages because they're being what the government officially called redeveloped, which pretty much means that they're rolling the bulldozers and wipe out the entire village with the exception of maybe an old historic temple or a tree. And instead you get these more generic luxury office or residential towers. This was a village in Guangzhou, and you can see how this old urban fabric gets replaced with these new towers. It's a very tricky process because the original village owners that actually own the land, they become millionaires. So in a typical village, let's say there's 50,000 people who live there, about 100 of the original villagers that used to live there, as they sell their land, they become multi-millionaires. But the vast majority of people, the migrants actually move to the village, they become homeless. So it's a huge problem, and they have to find other places to live. And instead you get the similar urban fabric that is otherwise known as tombstone urbanisms, these slabs that are set back because of daylight regulations. And these vast super blocks that you probably know more of because of Jeffrey's work. Now, is this an inevitable fate of all the urban villages? Do they necessarily need to, as they urbanize, as they settle up the rural land, as they build upwards to house more migrants, as the city around it gets wealthier and finally has the capital to buy up this village land, is it absolutely inevitable that the urban village subsides into the anonymity of the city? we looked at different trajectories of urban villages. What we found is that, first of all, that it varies a lot according to which geographic context you are in. So the cities that are most urbanized, they're the ones in which the urban village is literally tallest. And it's almost a function, the height of the urban village is almost a function of the lack of affordable housing. So a lot of the scholars on urban informality claim that urban informality is a result of the state's inability to provide affordable housing to its citizens, and this is clearly the case in China. So a lot of the migrants that are responsible for China's economic miracle and have contributed to the success of China's economy, they are not provided for by the state. And the lack of housing is somewhat reflected in these urban villages. The second thing that is really interesting is that each of these villages, because they're regulated by their own village collective, they are in charge of their own destiny. So depending on how this village collective bargains with the government and with developers, they can forge their own destiny, which perhaps in some cases is very different from total demolition, the default option of the state. So if you go to these villages, you have to go through these gates. It's literally a new institutional context where garbage collecting, they have their own police force, security force, they have their own management systems that are separate from the city. So the most famous or infamous example is Dachong village in Shenzhen. It's a village that became known for the illegal reproduction of paintings, fake paintings, including Van Gogh. And it's a great story. I mean, some people say that Shenzhen is responsible for about 30 or 40% of the world's total fake art inventory in hotels or something like that. But there's a great story of one of these Van Gogh reproducers who said that he in his lifetime had produced about 20 to 30,000 Van Goghs, whereas Van Gogh himself had only done about 300. So he was more Van Gogh than Van Gogh ever was. But what's interesting about this village is how it uses physical infrastructure, in this case the narrow alleys, as an asset, as a way to display the art, but also as a way to produce art. So painters from all over the country actually moved to the village. And here we interviewed this man who was kicked out of his apartment in the city because of all the oil smells that his landlord did not appreciate. And now he's here in the village, and he rented a few square meters of wall and produced his own painting. The village also uses some of the historic buildings as galleries. And now the city, or the village, even built its own contemporary art museum. This is designed by Urbanus, but it's interesting because now that the village really symbolizes this transition from the industrial reproduction of art to the post-industrial creation of original art. And this completely fits in this post-industrial economy that the Chinese government aspires to. Another interesting example is Xiaosha village in Shenzhen. And it's a village that managed to upgrade by clearing some of the buildings and building a large parking garage, and even built a museum to celebrate its own history. And here you can see this museum, which, for those of you who know South China, is also a replica of the border crossing terminal in between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And then finally, this was a great case study by Nick Smith, who was a ethnographer, and he studied Huanggang village in Shenzhen, and it's a village in which the village collective, they started their own shareholder company and developed the village themselves. So all these towers that you see here, and all these renovated village buildings, that's from their own hand. So instead of selling off the land, they actually decided to develop itself. And they built towers that were taller than the towers in the immediate context. And they also built CCTV, and the leader of the village collective claimed that the village was safer than the surrounding area, which is somewhat of a controversy because very often, as anywhere in the world, informal settlements and dwellers were stigmatized as prostitutes, burglars. So there's a lot of news articles in the China Daily that stigmatized the urban village residents. So this is completely subverting that stereotype and showing that they are more developed than, in fact, the city of Shenzhen itself. What's so interesting about this case is that they did manage to retain a balance between preserving some of its past, but also developing for the future. So this is a very interesting example of some alternative to total demolition. What it brings about is some exciting questions about whether urbanization comes from the top, as the Chinese government clearly aspires to, or in some cases how urbanization comes from below. In this case, as it has in the past, for instance, in a process called Synoikism in ancient Greece, when there was a series of villages that together coalesced into a city region. And in fact, if you look at China, up until the mid-1990s, it was the villages that produced the lion's share of China's GDP. It wasn't until the cities had the capital to convert the village land into formal city area that the city started outproducing the village. And as we know from the past, a lot of cities have been smart to incorporate villages into their urban fabric, as for instance, Stefan did in Barcelona, in which he laid out the grid to expand the city of Barcelona. Here's the old historic core. He made sure to also integrate already existing villages, in this case the village of Grafia. And not only that, he made sure to actually link it up to the city and celebrate this village. And right now, Paseo de Gracia, which is literally connecting the old medieval core of Barcelona to the village of Gracia, is the most expensive and the most interesting avenue in Barcelona. So here we see. So it's very wise to connect that and incorporate it into the design of this street. So Casa Lila, or La Pedrera by Gaudí is on this street. It was very wise to connect it. But even closer home, right here, when they start to lay out the Manhattan grid in the 19th century, they were very smart to also incorporate the hamlet that is now the West Village. Right? And arguably, it's because of these very different conditions in the grid, these narrower streets, these kind of winding, this more organic pattern, that this is a place that has the highest real estate values. Very ironically, as a lot of these villages are being demolished now, the shopping mall is taking the village as somewhat of a model. So this is Songting Village in Beijing. For those of you who haven't been there, it's a mixed-use complex of shops, but also restaurants. It's very popular. Part of the appeal is this outdoor experience. It's very different from typical mall. Here, sterile environments, but here you have a clear mimicking of these narrow streetscapes of the village. So in conclusion, it's ironic that Chinese city planners, desperately pondering to infuse identity into their cities, overlook the urban village. And I think that integrating their footprints, or even the layouts, could add more diversity into the city. I'm not arguing for keeping the village as is. I think the buildings will have to be redeveloped. But as in any city, buildings come and go, but streets and squares and anything that gives long-term identity to a place can be sustained. Thanks.